first time I saw a ghost, I was 4 years old. It was at my aunt's house during a party. I think I was the last kid still awake. We were sitting in a circle in a huge backyard, and in the silences between songs, I heard a little girl's voice behind me. When I turned around, I saw a little girl peeking out from behind a tree. Her face was completely white with a supernatural paleness, and I saw her run without moving her feet to hide from us. That night, I also discovered that not everyone can see ghosts. I wish that was the only ghost story I had to share, but there's a bigger one that changed my life and the lives of everyone close to me. It killed us all, in a way. For as long as I could remember, we lived in the blue house. That's what we called it. It was very pretty, big. An aunt had helped my parents buy it when they were younger. It had spare rooms and a very nice garden in the front. However, it seemed to be in the wrong neighborhood. It was a rich person's house in a poor area. They said it hadn't always been that way. That many years ago, it was just a beautiful house built on the edge of a stream with kilometers and kilometers of green fields around it. And the little cardboard houses started popping up little by little, one here, another a few meters away, all invading land that belonged to no one. Eventually, a low-income neighborhood emerged where people lived in houses made out of the most unimaginable materials. I guess anything is better than living on the street. From the living room window, you could see a 6-meter ravine that led to the stream. Nowadays, the water that flowed there sometimes smelled like detergent, and other times, most times, like sewage. Despite its terrible smell, I always liked going down there. I would sneak out through a hole dug under part of the fence. My parents didn't like me going out, not even to the corner store. It's a very dangerous neighborhood, they would say. And we weren't rich. We could have never afforded a house half that size in another part of the city. But I knew that our presence there, the fact that we lived there, in that house, made us look a certain way to the locals. The first time I snuck out and saw our house from below, from the canal, I realized how truly different everything else was. Every rock, every fence, even the trees were vandalized, scratched, full of graffiti. However, our house's walls remained intact, clean, not a single scratch. Sneaking out to the canal became my favorite pastime. I'd go play with the neighborhood kids, even though they all looked at me with distrust. All except Memo, who was barely a year older, but was much taller than me. Thanks to him, I was saved from several brawls, which I was too innocent to have started myself. Memo lived right across from our house, on the other side of the stream. From my bedroom window, I could see his back door. More than once, I saw him and his mom coming out to cry after his drunk dad got home through my window. Memo was also the only person my parents trusted to come into our house. I was about 8 years old when the accident happened. My mom and I got into a taxi to go to my grandma's house. An oncoming truck swerved into our lane, and the cab driver barely managed to avoid it, crashing into a lamppost. The driver, the only one not wearing a seatbelt, ended up 8 meters away from his taxi. My mom and I had to spend a few days in the hospital. Every time I'd fall asleep, my mom would come in and cry at my bedside. I saw her between dreams, and I'd tell her not to feel bad, that we were fine. When they discharged us, we spent a few days at Grandma's house so she could look after us while my dad worked. And a couple weeks later, we finally went back home. I was still wearing a neck brace. I had a horrible afternoon the day we got back. As soon as we walked in, I felt a terrible urge to vomit and a headache that felt like it was drilling through my skull. I asked my mom for some medicine and went to take a nap. It was 5 or 6 in the afternoon. I laid down with the bedroom door open. In and out of consciousness, I could hear Memo calling me from the street, and then my mom telling him I wasn't coming out to play. I closed my eyes and opened them just a few moments later. But the clock said it was already 9:30 at night. I could hear my mom cooking in the kitchen and the TV in the living room. That meant my dad had already gotten home. I suddenly felt like being with them, but it was as if I had no control over my body. I couldn't even lift my arms or fully open my eyes. I couldn't even yell at my mom that I was hungry too, to wait for me for dinner. And my eyes closed again. And again, I felt as if a moment had passed. But when I opened them, it was past 1 a.m. Like at the hospital, my mother was crying at the foot of my bed again. Her face was in her hands. I tried to tell her not to cry, but I could barely move, and I noticed I was soaked, sweating. "Don't cry, Mom, we're fine." I got up on shaky legs. They had fallen asleep, and I could barely move them. Still, I managed to get up and walk to the window to open it. I was so hot. I saw Memo's house light was on. I hope he's okay, I thought. I crossed the room, back towards my mother. "Everything will be all right," I told her. But when I touched her shoulder, it was horrendously bony, as if I had touched her bare bone, barely covered by any skin. Her hair was tangled, and her nightgown was dirty. That's when I realized that this woman, who was crying with her head in her hands on my bed, was not my mom. I ran to my parents' room and threw myself on their bed, crying for help. They tried calming me down, and my dad checked my room to make sure everything was in order. I still couldn't feel my legs, so my mom let me sleep with them that night. In the morning, my mom said she had also seen a woman in the house the previous afternoon. She said she had heard the house creaking, and then I noticed it too. It was subtle, but I could hear it. And I could also hear the sound of the water running in the stream behind us, louder than it had ever been before. My mom attributed all this to the accident, to a sensitivity that had been awakened in us. But we didn't know how it worked or how long it would last. She promised to talk to someone who knew about those things. And so she did. When I got home from school the next day, she welcomed me with a smile and pork chops, my favorite meal.
"Look at the photo behind you on the shelf,"
she said as she served me. In the photo, there was a very short, white-haired woman with an extremely friendly face. "What about her?" I asked.
"Is that the woman you saw last night?"
she said. I looked at the photo a little more carefully, but I couldn't say for sure. I hadn't actually seen her face.
"Don't worry about it anymore,"
my mom said.
"That's my grandma. I never met her, but my aunt says she's my angel now, that she's surely here to take care of us because of the accident."
"She's not an angel, Mom. She's a ghost," I replied. She looked at me with disappointment, so I apologized and she hugged me. Then, out of nowhere, my mom said into the emptiness,
"We know you're here, Tita, and you're welcome. We're very happy to have you with us."
I got a little chill hearing my mom talk to a ghost like that. It was eerie, but I returned to my pork chop. Then, a door creaked open upstairs, and the doorknob started rattling. My mom smiled and went upstairs. Then I heard her say something up there. Something I couldn't make out. Thank heavens, my dad got home right then because I was very uneasy. But I didn't tell him anything, and neither did my mom. She came back down and served him dinner, happy that he had gotten home in time to eat together. That day, something changed in my mom. She started talking in corners, in empty rooms, and waking up to cry in the early morning hours. Sometimes when I felt that woman in my room and dared to open my eyes, I could just make out her figure by the window. Other times, in the corner of the room, the feeling of her bony shoulder was impossible to erase from my memory. I remember one day, I was eating bean and cheese tacos at Memo's house, and I told him what was happening to us because of the accident. What my mom told me. We were just kids, but Memo was mature enough not to make fun of me. I told him about that ghost, that angel, as my mother called her. About Tita, my great-grandmother, who now wandered the halls of our house. That she was always present, out of the corner of your eye, hidden in the darkness, and that only my mother and I knew about her. Memo was about to respond when his mom interrupted him. They exchanged a look, something I didn't understand. So I finished eating and said goodbye. When I was almost to the stream, Memo shouted at me from his house, "Come here, we're going to tell you something." Confused, I went back inside. Without taking her eyes off Memo, his mother asked me, "You see a lady in a white nightgown with long hair? With black eyes? A black that fills her entire eye sockets?" "I don't know, I haven't seen her face," I answered, scared. "Look," Memo's mom told me very seriously. "From what you describe, what you see is a lady who has always been in that house. Way before you guys arrived. That's why nobody messes with that place. They say many years ago 2 young boys broke into the house when it was empty to see what they could steal, and they never came out. Every now and then, we can see that lady peering through the windows, looking towards the stream, to our cardboard houses with disdain." Suddenly, a distant scream from my house broke the silence, and I ran out of Memo's house. I was afraid to look up at the house's windows, because I felt someone could be watching me. But then, I couldn't help it. I looked up. Indeed, the figure was looking down angrily from my room. It was my mother. I hurried into the house and just barely managed to see the figure of a woman going into the kitchen, without moving her arms, without moving her feet, floating as if she was hanging from a rope and they were reeling her in. My dad was on the floor, in front of the stairs. There was blood on his forehead, and his wrist was broken. I could almost see the bone piercing his skin. Before I could ask him if he had fallen, he yelled out, "Someone pushed me down the stairs." I ran to my room to find my mom and yelled at her for ignoring my dad's scream. We took him to the hospital, but my dad wouldn't stop looking at my mom with distrust. It was natural for him to suspect that she had pushed him, since he wasn't aware of the things that had been going on in the house. And there was no one else there at the time. We spent a few hours at the hospital while they took care of him, and on the way back, I told him everything. Since my mom stayed silent, focused on driving through the storm, I felt my dad didn't believe me. We got back home, and I was resigned to having to live with this ghost. My dad didn't believe it, and my mom was convinced it was an angel. But this should have been the least of my worries. Days earlier, when Memo's dad felt a pang of guilt for his behavior, he bought Memo a couple of toy walkie-talkies. Memo gave me one, since I was the closest neighbor, and the toy walkies only had a few meters of range. I had almost forgotten about them with everything that was going on, until one night, when Memo radioed me to say my mom had gone out the back door towards the stream. I didn't believe him, but I realized the house was empty, so I went out back to check. I couldn't see anything. But as I was heading back home, I noticed someone closing the curtains in my bedroom window, so I sat at the house's entrance, afraid to go back inside, until my dad came home. I told him what had happened and we started looking for my mom. For hours. Then, for days. Eventually for months. I once cursed her in front of my aunts for leaving us, for not seeking help sooner. And one of my aunts scolded me, saying I had no idea what my mother had had to endure, of what she had seen in that house. I realized then That they didn't know I could also see the ghostly woman, but also that my mom perhaps could see something else that I couldn't. From then on, my dad completely changed, spending almost all his time with me. He rarely left me alone, and I know that affected his job, but the truth is, I didn't want to be alone either. Almost a year later, I was getting in bed around 10 as usual. I closed my bedroom curtains and noticed Memo at his back door waving at me, motioning for me to turn on the walkie-talkie. I dug it up and asked him what was going on, if he was okay, mainly worried that his father had gone on another binge. Right then, I heard my house door open and close quietly, as if a burglar had come inside.
Dude, your mom just jumped the fence and went into your backyard,
Memo said. I dropped the radio instantly and ran out of the room to look for her. I wasn't afraid, just excited. My dad heard me screaming and came to look for her with me. Both of us had tears in our eyes, but there was nobody there. We were alone, just the two of us. The night after, I heard my dad curse out loud when he came home from work. I raced downstairs to see what was going on. He told me that when he entered, there was an old lady sitting in the dark living room, but she disappeared when he turned on the light. It was the first time my dad saw something strange in that house. But the nightmare was just beginning, because we never heard from my mom again. I invite any skeptic or anyone who likes making fun of other people's ghost stories to my house. If you don't believe me, come over. I dare you to say the following out loud. Any spirit in this house, no matter where you come from, you're welcome. This is your house. Then we'll see if you still don't believe. Something inhabited the blue house way before we arrived there. Maybe even before the house was built. Who knows? Some said that figure was the first owner, angry about what happened to the area surrounding the house. But others told a different story, that this same entity was responsible for driving the original owner mad, and that, in the end, because of it, the owner disappeared, just like my mother. Well, we'll never be able to confirm that. That sensitivity that had awakened in me after the accident, that had allowed me to see so much for so long, disappeared over time. And after many months, it became more and more unusual for that presence to wake me up at night. I also stopped hearing the stream sound as clearly. But Memo and his family, some neighbors too, kept seeing the woman peering through the windows at night, staring hatefully from my bedroom window at the houses down by the stream, especially when my father and I were not there. For a long time, the neighbors thought it was my mother peering out the window. But now, there was no doubt. It was that woman, that entity inhabiting the house. She had returned. Don't miss the next episode, the second part to this story. This has been Tales of the Night.